everyone. Welcome to Curated Knowledge, a podcast where we talk about the good news that's happening in the world in terms of technology, science, medicine, society in general, and we just kind of gab and think about what that could mean for our world and how we need to make it a better place by highlighting these good stories. So I'm joined as usual by my co-host, Annie Peralty. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. How are you doing?
Doing well. It's another weekend again, which is always nice.
A bit rainy here, but otherwise, it's pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, we have the positive temperatures out, so
Yeah.
I'm not going to complain.
Yeah, rain is better than snow when we're heading into March.
So the first story I want to talk about today is MIT's fusion breakthrough. So the intention here is that with a smaller, more efficient magnet or superconducting magnet that is super reduced in size and greatly amplified in magnetic field generation, it means that we could be one step closer to not just a fusion reactor, because we already know that they have done a fusion reactor and they've had positive amount of energy come out of it, but this makes it more of an economically sound fusion reactor by removing some of the extra insulation that's required to kind of keep this super hot plasma in the reactor. And I think all of these advancements in fusion over the last, let's say, it feels like the last 3 to 5 years, have really changed it from a technology that's always 10 years away to one that we actually have an understanding now of how to do, but what, right? So I think it's really great that MIT posted about this, and I'm always excited about new superconducting magnets, but what are your thoughts when you hear this?
Well, I always get fusion and fission confused, but fusion is like the coming together of the atoms, and it's the one that we've been really struggling to be able to do, where the amount of power that it takes to get it together is less than the amount of power that it actually generates, right? And now we are actually seeing where the amount of energy that we put in is less than the amount of energy that's coming out of it, right?
Correct.
But it's still not very efficient.
No, I guess the answer to that, though, is does it have to be, right? So any technology that produces more energy than it costs ends up being a value add to society.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say if we can continue that, like, this is the worst the technology will ever be. It's going to get
Yeah.
better from here. So if we can develop this technology in a way where it's proliferated very widely, then I think we have an opportunity here to make fusion actually work. My big issue with this, and something that I think we've talked about before, is the runway, the road to build a fusion reactor is just so long. And we are nearing a point of needing just so much more energy for our society.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of people are hanging their hats on the idea that fusion could be that savior of humanity because it doesn't really pollute, it doesn't create a whole bunch of nuclear waste, it doesn't have a lot of the downsides of a nuclear power plant, it's safer, its energy generating capacity is potentially nearly limitless, kind of like harnessing a mini sun. By the time we get a real reactor online, we're going to be playing a fun game of chase with the technology, and we're looking at a decade, 2 decades, again, that whole like 10 years out kind of attitude. So
Mm-hmm.
do you think it's worthwhile to chase fusion as a way to generate energy?
Well, you've mentioned many, many times in our like just regular conversations about how the real sticking point for us being able to live in an equitable society is power, is the ability to generate enough power for people to live. And so elaborate a little bit more. Tell us your point of view in that.
So when I think about electricity being the requirement for a good future, I'm thinking about the energy needed to build, multi-level farms in cities, the energy to desalinate salted ocean water for places that can't easily get water, or being able to extract water from the air in an efficient way, and not necessarily worry about the energy costs or the negative side effects from a climate change perspective, right? A lot of our energy right now comes from sources that pollute.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that if you look at places where there isn't a lot of energy availability for a person, you'll find a person that does not have the traditional modern lifestyle. And if we want to get to that next level, that like Star Trek-esque future, we need a whole bunch more energy to do that. And I love the idea of fusion. It was one of those technologies as a kid where I was like, yeah, like I can't wait until we can have a star and a power plant and we could make like so much energy and it's going to be great and it's going to be cheap and it's going to be safe. And, here I am now in 2024 and they're saying, yeah, maybe by 2034 we'll have a reactor that can actually do this in a meaningful way. But my concern, my worry is that as they start building a fusion reactor, they're going to continue to develop the technology, and it's always going to end up looking like a really dumb bet, right? Where it's like, I build this giant reactor, I spend billions, dozens of billions of dollars to build this reactor, and by the time it's done, all of the technology in it will be out of date.
Well, that's kind of like going to space, right? Like the first spaceships that went up didn't use the latest technology by the time they were up there. And even like the rockets that were going up in the 90s, they were less powerful than the cell phones that were existing at that time. And sometimes we just gotta start the ball rolling and be a little bit out of date. And then now we've got like the SpaceX rockets going up and they're, pretty on par with what's going on technologically, or at least less far behind than the spaceships were with NASA. And I think that in order for us to really get into that fusion or that fusion energy generation, you have to start somewhere, right? And if it's out of date, then it's out of date. Then you build the next one a little bit more future proof, and you keep trying to get a little bit more future proof. And every time you do it, you learn a little bit more. And you mentioned like if it's net positive, then it's a win, right?
Yeah, I guess my only concern about that is, could we not be spending that money in terms of building a fusion reactor, in terms of fusion research on advancing geothermal, advancing solar, advancing wind, advancing hydro, advancing tidal, these other technologies that have already kind of proven themselves in a lot of different ways and are so much cheaper for an install basis than anything we'll ever be able to do with fusion.
Yeah, well, I don't think you abandon what's currently working, right? But if you think about, there's people who how do I put this? Like, I'm not a scientist, right? I am a student of psychology, and my brain, that area, that focus, right? Mental health, that's what I am interested in, right? I could make the world a better place through that. I can't make the world a better place through brain surgery, right? But there are people who are capable of making the world a better place through brain surgery, at least for the person that they're operating on that day. So if there are people who have the time, energy, ability, financial ability to do it, why not let them explore it and do it in places where geothermal isn't going to work, where solar isn't going to work, where wind isn't going to work, where ocean tides and like that really adorable plane that we talked about previously, underwater plane, where those aren't going to work, right? Where fusion could work and where things that are more damaging to the planet currently are working. And what kind of things could we not necessarily retrofit, but take that footprint and build something else on top of it that is more sustainable, more beneficial, and less destructive.
Yeah, at the end of the day, I think we both agree that whatever path forward we take in terms of energy generation, it can't be actively polluting.
Correct. Absolutely.
So, like, simple as that.
Yeah, and the more options we have, the better, right? If you have more things in that grab bag, you put your hand in, you pick something up, right? If you only have one thing, it's not going to work as well.
Moving on from that, the second story I have for us today is talking about scar-free surgery. Thanks to 3D printing technology, being able to print living skin and maybe even hair right into wounds. So this technology is already working on rats and mice and things like that, but they feel, the researchers from Pennsylvania State University, are close to being able to try this on a human. And the reason that this is so important, of course, is that any kind of skin grafting technology that we currently use is not providing the same full thickness skin that your body has everywhere else. And so you can get scarring and you can have all kinds of issues. And so for reconstructive surgery, skin grafts are going to be potentially left in the dust by this technology if it actually comes to pass. What are your thoughts on this?
Immediately my thought was, after a surgery, the idea of like 3D printed skin and hair was like, ugh. But then as I was thinking about it, and you mentioned like reconstructive surgery, then it took on a different kind of life inside my mind, right? Where I'm thinking about like, if you have like an abdominal surgery and nobody really sees your abdomen anyway, and do you really want like 3D printed hair follicles when it's something like that? But if you have like a burn in a noticeable place, right? Or you were in a car accident and you've got scarring on your face, that would be life changing to be able to have this less noticeable and more functional alternative to skin grafts. That would be.
And the idea that it can potentially be scar free, right? So the intention there being that you don't have the weakness of scar tissues, you don't have the visual distortion or issues that you have with scars. I think about young children who have like burns, like you mentioned, and how frustrating it must be for them to wear that for the rest of their lives. And so while I think this technology will eventually be used for small cosmetic things like patching up after some kind of small surgery, I think for now the intent is really that focus on, the reconstructive surgery to correct trauma on the face or the head or visible areas, to assist in preventing permanent hair loss, to allow people to really have this kind of full and healthy life after dealing with like potentially a very traumatizing event.
Yeah. And I'm also wondering, with certain burns, there is residual pain and tissue and nerve damage. And I wonder if these or these 3D printed skin scarring fixer things, if they would be less likely to cause that persistent pain afterwards.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. They don't talk about that specifically in here. It's really just focused on wound healing, allowing hair to grow again, having like that full thickness of skin. But yeah, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, who knows, right? Well, somebody somewhere knows, probably. They're not on this podcast. But for right now, even just like if you still have that physical pain, to not have the psychological pain of the disfigurement is still a huge improvement.
Yeah, and again, I think one of the things that I like to repeat in these episodes is a really strong reminder that I think more people really need to have, which is this is the worst the technology will probably ever be. And here we are in 2024, and they're using 3D printer technology and stem cell technology to figure out how to do scar-free surgery prints on living skin, and how important or valuable that could be for so many people around the world. And I think we both know, though, part of the money that's going to end up going to whatever company is created from this Penn State team will probably end up getting a whole bunch of money from the cosmetic or like the beauty industry to deal with little tiny scars and things like that. But if it advances the technology for everyone else, I guess that might be a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of goes back to that question of like doing the right thing for the wrong reasons versus doing the wrong thing for the right reasons, right? But like, if it's going to benefit people and they're using it in a way that's going to reduce psychological suffering, right? Then if the money's coming from cosmetic surgeries, those are also, in a lot of cases, stopping somebody from having some psychological suffering because they don't like what they see in the mirror.
Yeah. And one last point I wanted to make is that this could be automated as well as part of like a surgical process. They could position this over the wounded area, or instead of going in with a skin graft, and the machine can actually figure out how best to lay down this bioprinted material in a way that is efficient and works as effectively as possible. And I think that is a really interesting idea in and of itself, because we don't really talk about automation in healthcare very often, and we certainly don't talk about 3D printing in healthcare very often, but the idea that this could be potentially done by someone that doesn't necessarily have to have a deep well of talent, I think is also interesting to me. This potentially makes this technology available to more places in the world where maybe other technologies, maybe even good people doing skin grafts, good surgeons doing skin grafts, or the technology to grow a skin graft rapidly doesn't exist.
Well, I think that there's also another side of it that is when they're doing a skin graft, that skin has to come from somewhere. And so you have the injury that they're grafting over, but in order to do that, they're also creating another injury, where this takes away that secondary injury of where we're grabbing the skin from, right? So it can be done by more people, done in more different areas, and it's also less invasive on the person who's getting the surgery done.
Sounds like a big win. And rolling from one win right into another, there was an article on The Atlantic that caught my eye talking about how there is a new treatment for cystic fibrosis. It's called Trikafta, and they are basically saying that it has revolutionized the lives of patients, allowing them to live longer and healthier lives than ever before. By correcting the misshapen protein that causes the disease, Trikafta thins mucus in the lungs, making it easier to cough up. Patients who take it experience a dramatic improvement in lung function. So, before I ask your thoughts, one of the pieces of context I want to give is that when the disease was first identified in the 1930s, and again, this is from the article, most babies born with CF died in infancy. The next decades were a grind of incremental medical progress. A child born with CF in the 50s would expect to live around age 5, in the 70s around age 10, in the early 2000s age 35. And with this treatment, they're talking about these people in a recent study have been projected that they can expect to live up to the age of an average of 82.5,
Whoa.
which is essentially a normal lifespan.
Wow, that is amazing. I actually remember when I was growing up, there was a kid that I knew who was a few years older than me who had CF, and I remember them wearing the mask and having to do like lung treatments and stuff like that to be able to breathe. And they went through 2 different lung transplants when I was in my 20s. And they passed away a good number of years ago. So their lifespan was probably right around 30, born in the late 70s, early 80s. So the fact that these people are now have that long of a life expectancy, the same as pretty much any of us, that's amazing. And I'm curious about how do they take this medication, and how frequently do they have to take it, and what is it, how invasive is it,
So yeah, I don't have all that information.
I know.
I'll definitely have to read more into the article to understand that, but the interesting part there is it's a drug designed for people with a specific mutation. So this is not considered a cure. It doesn't work for all patients, but we're talking about turning around what was essentially a terminal diagnosis into something that it's uncomfortable and it sucks and it's not perfect, and hopefully for the majority this will provide them that long life. But removing the fact that this is going to be a terminal diagnosis for most people, I think is a super impressive advancement, and a reminder that as much as we talk about these different technologies not necessarily coming to light, or that everything with a medical bent to it takes forever, we're finally seeing the results or the fruit of that labor, so to speak. And so while I know a lot of people that I've seen talk about this are disappointed that we didn't have this earlier because they know of someone who didn't have a very long life due to cystic fibrosis, I think the fact that this has come out at all and this is happening at all is amazing. And the study, as far as I'm aware, was on 40,000 Americans who will basically now live through a miracle of their time where, they can look at having a natural lifespan.
And like you said with other things, right? This is the earliest version of it, right? This is the worst it's going to be moving forward, right? And they might be able to find ways of helping if there was other, was it a gene that you mentioned? Yeah, if there's other genes that also cause CF, they might be able to find ways of using it on those genes.
Yeah, and even if there's like a reduction in the number of side effects you have from this disease, I think, even without a cure, that's still pretty powerful, right? Like, does a disease really matter if it doesn't negatively impact your life?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think we've talked about before the way that, if any of us went into a full body CT or MRI scan, they'd find things that are wrong with us. They're just not causing us distress. So, if you're able to give people a normal, quote, life, and whatever's wrong isn't causing them distress, then it's really quality of life, right? And being able
Yeah.
to extend a person's quality of life, anything that we can do to extend the quality of life is a huge bonus. Reducing the suffering that people experience in this world is a huge thing.
Yeah, and I think that, again, I want to make sure I make this clear in the episode. This is not a cure for cystic fibrosis. It doesn't even get rid of all of the issues. It just improves lung function,
Mm-hmm.
which singularly has been identified as a key predictor of the amount of, like, the long-term survival of the patient. So being able to help a person with cystic fibrosis breathe better, cough up any of that kind of fluid in their lungs better, makes the quality of their life hopefully much improved, and
Mm-hmm.
the length of their life doubled what we've seen without treatment, or with the current levels of treatment that we have available.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, I mean, we're not talking about cure, but we are talking about extension of life and extension of quality.
And so the last thing I wanted to talk about today is an article on New Atlas, which says post-labor economics. Will capitalism work when the robots take over? It was written on March 8th, and it's really an interesting read. And I think we've had so many discussions, you and I. And I mean, I feel like I'm having these discussions with all kinds of people all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But they talk about independent AI researcher and YouTuber David Shapiro and the video that he posted about post-labor economics and how the world might work as we transition or as we change how our society is organized. And I think one of the really interesting key things that is pointed out in this is that we will really need to define a new social contract. So currently we live in a world of owners and workers.
Mm-hmm.
And if we replace all the workers with technology, what happens to the workers, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I would love to hear your thoughts on how you see this unfolding. Where is the positive path to the future on dealing with post-labor economics, or with AI and automation replacing all jobs?
I remember over a decade ago watching the YouTube video Humans Need Not Apply and
Mm,
being a little bit scared and also like, oh, that's never going to happen. But here we are, and here it is happening. I think that there really needs to be a huge paradigm shift away from what it means to be a valuable member of society, right? And what it means to be like actively contributing. And where a person's worth, value, success isn't tied to a paycheck, but tied to other things, right? I would really love to see us in a more Star Trek type world, right? Where you're doing the things that make you feel good when you're doing them, right? Things that spark joy, things that spark creativity, things that make you feel that this is the legacy that you want to leave for humanity, right? If that's art, if it's, scientific research, if it's helping people, if it's building houses, if it's traveling through space, whatever it is that is like that thing that you would do even if you weren't being paid for it, and then you're not needing to be paid for it.
So, as someone who does study psychology, I would be interested in your thoughts on two things. One, the idea of, everything moves towards entropy. So if you don't have a set purpose or a set requirement or limitation on your life, you would likely just sit and watch YouTube all day. And two, how do you define, like, how do you build joy in a world where machines can do everything that you find joy in better than you?
Okay, so that first thing about entropy, I think that we are communal beings. Even when you have an introverted personality or when you have different types of mental illness, we're still social beings. We still really need other people around us. And I think that when our value isn't tied to a paycheck, when it isn't tied to ownership of X, Y, and Z, then our value becomes tied to connection. And I think that there will probably be some people who, especially in the early days, right? When all of a sudden it's like, I don't need to work 3 jobs to keep a roof over my head. And I'm not, constantly sending out resumes and interviewing and having every job being taken by robots, right? It's going to be this huge paradigm shift away from this go, go, go worker mentality and into whatever comes next, right? And there will be a period of just sitting there going, okay, well, I guess I'm on permanent vacation. And permanent vacation can feel good for some people and it can feel really bad for other people. It depends on what kind of a vacation it is, right? And taking an active role in your life, going, I've always wanted to blah, but I haven't had time because of work. Well, now you have the time, so go do blah.
Which brings me to my second part of my question, which is, if I want to learn the guitar, but it's just easier to type in a prompt in an AI and get the guitar riff that would take me weeks to learn, or if I could type in a prompt and get an entire novel custom written for me, why am I going to put in the effort to try to hone those skills and build an understanding of crafting a narrative and dialogue and framing devices and all these things that seem difficult and that seem hard to do, and there's this easy road that a machine can just do it for me. So how do I find that little hit of excitement or dopamine or whatever when it feels like everything that I want to do is going to take a bunch of time and machines are doing it better, faster, and cheaper?
Connection. And right now, you can go to the store and you can buy a quilt. You can go to the store and you can buy a knit sweater. You can go to the store and you can buy a bowl, right? But when somebody hand makes you a bowl and it is hand created on a pottery wheel and it has those flaws in it and you can see where their fingerprints are, there's a connection there, right? They took the time to do that and to give it to you. When you have a blanket that you're sitting under that somebody has hand crocheted or hand knitted for you, it feels like they're actually hugging you. It's different than sitting underneath the quilt that you got from Walmart. So why would you take the time to do those things? Because that's where your connection comes. That's where there's this person, his name's Sheldon Solomon, and he came up with this idea of terror management theory, okay? And the idea with terror management theory is it's part of existentialism, and we're going into like really big brain psychology stuff here. But the idea is we are creatures who know that we are mortal. We know that our life is finite, and we know that we're going to die. And that is terrifying. It is terrifying. You know that someday you're going to leave this planet and you're never going to come back. So what do you do to manage that terror? You find meaning. Where do you find meaning? You find meaning in the things that really feel like they connect you to the community, the things that connect you to this world, and the things that you can leave behind when you're gone. So for some people, that's a family. For some people, it's a book. For some people, it's a guitar riff. For some people, it's a whole bunch of crocheted blankets. For some people, it's pottery. For some people, it's whatever, right? So our terror management theory is the thing that's going to give us that meaning when work is no longer our meaning.
So as we transition, there's going to be a whole bunch of people that are going to say, how do I figure out the thing that I want to do with my time? Like, how do I understand what will bring me joy? And do you have any thoughts on that?
Explore. Try. Give it a go. Whatever it is, right? Sit down. Do some drawing. See how that feels. If you do a month of drawing and you're like, I really hate this, then that's not your thing, right? If you sit there and you play guitar and you're like, I cannot get calluses enough to make this worth my while, that's not your thing, right? If you're going to go jogging and you're like, I'm scared of, all the beasties in the forest, that's not your thing. So it's about exploring and trying to figure out what your thing is. Giving it all a go. When you've got the time, you've got the time to explore and find it.
And I think that's the real point about this whole thing. When we talk to people who have a capitalist mindset, they can't fathom, one, how will you feed yourself? Well, the quote-unquote government or the world order or whatever you want to call it will feed me. Well, what about a house to live in? And what if you want a bigger house and all these things, right? We're so programmed by this capitalist ideal of you have to have cash in hand and you have to trade that cash for the things that you want. And to get that cash, you have to trade hours of labor. And that is the structure that we've had for a long time, but not forever. That hasn't been the only way humanity has existed.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's so many people out there that I run into that can't even fathom what this post-labor economic situation would look like. And I feel like the generations coming up behind us are going, they intuitively know that it's a little bit scary right now and the transition's going to be scary, but they also know somehow, like some of the ones that I've talked to just seem to know that it has to happen because the way the world works today just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And I think that is really interesting.
And I think that when we move from a me to an us mentality and this idea of taking care of each other, when you have enough because everybody else has enough, and when you don't need to worry about having a roof over your head that can also hold everybody else's heads because they're all living on the edge of homelessness, it changes. You don't need to hoard that anymore because everybody's taken care of, right? When there's enough food for everybody, nobody's starving.
Yeah, and we can all only eat so much.
Exactly. I'm sure that there were, like, for a while, there will people who just gluttonize, right? And they're like, oh, I'm going to take all the things. Because it's breaking a programming. It's undoing what has been this is how we survive, right? It used to be that we survived by actually going and hunting animals out in the bush. Most of us don't do that anymore. We go to the grocery store and we get our food. And we don't, do the hunter and gathering thing. That changed. And this is another period where things are changing. Even in the past century, the world that we live in has changed. The way that we do things has changed. We used to not be able to have these long conversations with somebody who isn't directly sitting in front of us, right? 100 years ago there was the radio. The radio could talk to us. But it wasn't the same. It wasn't, I'm going to go and click this button and listen to these people talk right now because I have 15 minutes to listen. It was, okay, at 6 o'clock the radio is going to play this show and I hope it's something that I like, right? The world has changed and it continues to change. And 100 years ago, nobody had ever been to the moon. And in 100 years, they're going to be saying, 100 years ago, people lived like that. Can you believe that?
And hopefully, when they look back, they'll be looking back from a place of huge advantages and advancements from where we are today. Mm-hmm. I really appreciate you taking the time to unpack some of the psychology of these changes with me. I think that it's important as we deal with this transition that we don't just look at the fearful parts. We look at the exciting parts and we look at the hopeful parts. And that's really why this show exists, to talk about the hopeful things that we're finding in terms of modern technology. And I hope you'll all continue to join us on that journey. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you.